Welcome to Story Hour, a virtual meetup hosted by Wolf and Heron.
So, I didn't know how my family would take it when I came out of the closet, but in the end, it ended up just spilling out as a text message in the first month of the shutdown. And that text message was roughly, well, the weed fairy is telling me to go on a run, and I'm going to do what she says. That's right. I'm addicted to running, and I use weed to keep it from becoming too much of a problem. But a lot of the time, I do both at once. Anyway, that's just preamble. What I want to tell you about is actually a love affair. So take a minute and indulge me with a visualization, because I'm going to go into some vulnerable territory. Close your eyes and visualize the world's largest garage sale. So think about furniture, kitchenware, odds and ends, CDs, even vinyl records, and like picture frames, and so forth. Now, imagine it getting hit by a huge freaking tornado. That is what the inside of my head looks like if I go 3 days without running. I have ADD. I have the daydreamy subtype, not the hyperactive subtype. And I dispute that attention deficit disorder should really be called a disorder. It has its uses, especially when you consider the human genome as a whole. For example, you really don't want to be running a large company and not have at least a couple of people with ADD on your board, because they're really good at lateral thinking and identifying opportunities and making associations that normal people are blind to. But ADD certainly does have its drawbacks. It hampers you from doing certain things, especially the way that our society is structured. You wouldn't want to work on a team where everyone had it. It can bring out a lot of good, worthwhile ideas, but without guidance and accountability from normal people, they never really tend to get off the ground. Self-care and self-management strategies are really important to understand whoever you are. And for me, running has been really key over the years. Running makes your brain poop out a bunch of chemicals that make you focused and cheerful. So I swing from being hyperproductive right after a run to being cognitively worthless after about 3 days, and I have to continuously reset. Just like a border collie will chew up the furniture if you don't take him to the park and throw a frisbee around every day. ADD is marked by deficits of 3 chemicals that are tied to focus and cheerfulness, and that's dopamine, serotonin, and adrenaline. And because people who have ADD also tend to have a restless, curious nature, I've enjoyed experimentation with drugs in general, starting with coffee. It's been a love affair. And that brings me to my next point. Nothing is more annoying than people who pretend not to like drugs. And if you don't see it the same way I do, when was the last time you drank a cup of coffee and thought, you know what, instead of driving off a bridge, I think that I'll go to the gym? Or the last time you relaxed with a boozy drink after a stressful day? So don't look down on me if I happen to like cannabis and psychedelics. Humans like drugs. Well-adjusted, responsible people can thrive on them. And yes, intelligent people destroy their lives and relationships with them. And yes, a lot of idiots also like drugs, particularly alcohol. But I believe the abundance of naturally occurring psychoactive substances in plants is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. My own take on Ben Franklin's famous quip about beer. This all brings us to about 2.5 weeks ago. While I do everything in moderation, I also do about everything. I have a script for Ambien. I have a script for dextroamphetamine, which is a stimulant prescribed for ADD. I drink coffee almost daily. I have about 3 drinks a week. And I have a warm and affectionate relationship with cannabis. I don't use any of these things in large quantities or at weird times of the day or inappropriate situations. For instance, I take about a quarter of the originally prescribed dose of ADD meds. But over the course of 2020, the angst of being alive has just ratcheted up little by little. And my relationship with some of these substances was becoming a source of anxiety to me. So 2.5 weeks ago, I quit all of them at once. So that made for some very low productivity mornings and some emotionally challenging evenings. It was very hard, but I did it. And by and by, my brain got used to pooping out its own chemicals again. And although I have no intention of living my whole life like a saint, I've learned some valuable things. First, I learned that I no longer need ADD meds. And if I'm honest with myself, one of the key drivers of my continuing to take them after graduate school, when I actually did need them, is that they're euphoriants. They make you feel good. They make me less dependent on my long cherished self-management strategies, such as running. And while I will occasionally continue to use them when I need to get, say, 20 hours of work done in, say, 4 hours, because they make your brain feel like an F-14 if you don't do them for 2 weeks and then start taking them again. I'm glad to have cut that ball and chain. I feel more composed overall. I sleep better, and I may even live longer for having quit them. The second thing I learned is that if I avoid alcohol and uppers, I almost never need Ambien, and I'm terrified of becoming habituated to sleep meds, so I'll generally avoid those other things as part of the bargain. 3, I will, if anything, make it an even greater priority to trip on psychedelics at least once a year. They've made me a higher functioning, more empathetic, more creative person, and even a more generally virtuous person. And 4, finally, even to the extent that drugs like coffee and cannabis do benefit me, I will take periodic breaks to hit reset. So I want to conclude by presenting what I consider one of the great existential questions of being a human being. To what extent should we consume substances to function better, to recreate, to sharpen or distort our perceptions? What's the boundary between functional substance use and problematic substance use? What does the dramatic influence of substances, especially synthetic legal ones, have on our personalities and decisions? And what does that say about the nature of the self? What is self? Who are we really? Who am I? I have no ambition to answer these questions today, but I have a 4-pronged philosophy about drugs, and I'll share the first 2 of those. 1, there are no bad drugs. There are no drugs that have no use in any context. There are no bad drugs, but there are clearly damaging and problematic drug behaviors. And 2, when a drug becomes a substitute for a healthy self-management or coping strategy, whether that's long-distance running or nourishing social bonds, it is at best a slippery slope. But mainly, I just want to say, drugs, I love you, and I'm really glad that I'm out of the drug closet. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for sharing your story. Okay. What did Sean do well? What should he hold on to? What was powerful? And raise your hand to contribute. Sarah.
The use of the P's, pause, was fantastic. Like, there are several places in there where there was such a pause, and it was really, really helpful to your story to have those, like, kind of punchy moments with those pauses. And then I honestly, I was looking to see what superpower this is and what P it is. I don't know where it fits, but I am a metaphor person, and the metaphors that you select in this story and then the other stories that you tell, like, honestly, I found myself telling someone else about your piglets at one point. Like, the metaphors that you select are so descriptive that they really, really stick with me as a listener. They're just very vibrant, and they move your story along in a way. Like, it was just very funny. Like, some of them, which the humor thing is separate from that, but it just gives such a good illustration of the points that you're making. I really, really, in this and all your other stories, enjoy those metaphors.
Thanks, Sarah.
What else?
Just to go off of that, I loved the garage sale metaphor because, and just having us like close our eyes, because then we could really sit with that visual as a listener. So that was really fun. And similarly to what you just said, I like love the way you tell stories. There's just like a way, the delivery is always just so engaging, and it's quiet and subtle, but there's just something there that's like amazing about it. And I just love like the personification and of the drugs, and also this, like, you kind of assume that the audience would be judging you. So you're like, don't judge me. And I really like that too. Because even if we're not, you know that feeling still and can resonate. So yeah.
Stephanie.
Thanks, Molly.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate, and I've seen this now happen a couple of times with your stories, is that you are able to interweave plot and character dynamics and all the elements of a story with, I'm going to call it like teaching moments, if that's the right word, where you like tell us a little bit about like what is ADD and what are the chemicals that are missing in your brain. And like, I always learn something, and it's, and there's a part of me that's like, well, you could take all that out and just strip it down to the story. And then there's a part of me that like really kind of likes that you've managed to like weave these things together in a way where I'm open to and listening to new information, and it's wrapped in a story really nicely.
Thanks, Stephanie.
I appreciated your vulnerability in telling your story. You didn't mention the word bravery once, I don't think, but you were brave in that sharing your ADD and your position on drug use and your observations about that, in that it was brave. I have to be honest, it was challenging for me to listen to at times because I come from a long history of alcoholics. I've been into AA myself for 20 years, and I slipped on marijuana a year ago. So I'm like, I go through all this kind of stuff in my brain about, alcohol and drugs and, so it was tough for me to listen to it at times, but I appreciate your honesty and your perspective, and you have a right to your perspective, so that's what I got.
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah.
All right. What should John consider next time, or what might he experiment with if he were to tell this story again? Robert.
A little bit shorter. It did go on a little bit too long, I felt. I think it was 10 minutes. I don't know. It felt like it was 10 minutes. But just shorten it up a little bit, tighten it up.
I didn't tell you. I'm sorry.
I was about to ask.
From my perspective, everything in it was interesting, but it felt like it could have been a variety of stories, which is quite common in these story hours. But it's like, I almost wanted, I wanted the story around the existential questions. I wanted the story around what else is happening in your life if your brain is like the biggest yard sale in the whole world. Each of those moments, and maybe the family dynamics and the fallout around coming out as a drug user. Like, each of those moments was interesting in and of itself. And there were like 8 things that I was intrigued by that I would have wanted to carry through. And you, in some ways, talked about all of them. So I think it's just about picking and choosing, and maybe you were still processing some of how you wanted to share that as you were writing, which is quite common. What else might John?
Thanks, Kara.
Yeah, Molly. You're on mute.
Sorry. The only thing I wrote down was I would have loved your story to end with existential questions, because it was like so on brand with the way you were telling the story and the way you were describing the drugs, and just, I think just the nature of that story, it isn't an existential question in of itself. So I would have loved if not even if you just shifted it to the end of where your story ended, it just was a good place to leave the audience with yeah, what do I think about those questions?
Thanks.
To the comment that Sarah had earlier about what was done well, the metaphors were done well, and I found myself wondering, John, if it would be interesting. It's a strength of yours, and I think part of that comes from the writing, but interesting, do you tell a story where you specifically try to put a metaphor in every other sentence in a way? And that's part of what's kind of clever about it, because there were so many of them that it became an interesting intellectual thing to notice every time it happened. So I just think that would be something interesting to either really lean into that even more, or perhaps edit them down, actually, because there were so many of them that they were noticeable. So I would just be conscious of that. Something to play around with.
Right.
Sarah.
So the other, Molly mentioned the personification of of drugs in general, and it would be interesting to me to hear you go just even further with that. You opened it up with coming out of the closet, and I think it would be really, well, one, it would be humorous to me, maybe not to everyone, but to almost hear that as told as a relationship, and then as you broke up with that relationship. And then I think you could do a ton with that. And really, again, I'm going back to the metaphors because they were so bright and really told that story. I think there's a lot you could do to give that a life of its own kind of within the story.
Those are great ideas. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. And thank you, John, for telling your story.
Thanks, everyone.
Visit wolfandheron.com to find out more about our story hours.